My name is Olivia. I turned 30 this past October, and for the first time in years, I decided to spend my holidays away from the city I live in, away from the noisy routine and the people who knew me too well. My grandfather's house in upstate New York seemed like the perfect place to disappear for a while. He's in his late 80s now, still spry in his own way, but mostly he spends his days by the fireplace, reading old books and sipping tea, the television murmuring in the background. When I arrived, winter had already taken over. Snow clung stubbornly to the sidewalks and rooftops, turning the little town into something out of a postcard. The air smelled sharp and clean, and each breath puffed into a cloud in front of me. People here seemed to know each other by name, greeting one another at the bakery or post office, as if they'd been doing it for decades, which they probably had. It should have been comforting, but instead it made me feel like an outsider looking in. My grandfather welcomed me with his usual gentle warmth, making sure the guest bedroom was cozy and reminding me where he kept the extra blankets. He was happy to have me there, but I knew my visit was more about me needing a change than him needing company. The first few days passed quietly. I helped him shovel the driveway, carried wood for the fireplace, and joined him for dinners at the small kitchen table. But every evening, once the sun went down and the quiet became too thick, I felt the pull of the outside world. I've always been open about who I am. I like women, I've dated women, and I've loved them too. Being here, in this small, frozen town, I didn't expect much in the way of meeting someone. Still, the thought lingered. So I started going out. Not in a loud, wild way, but in my own quiet search for connection. I found a few bars scattered across town, some cozy cafes that smelled of cinnamon and roasted coffee beans. I'd sit at a corner table, sip something strong, sometimes coffee, sometimes whiskey, and watch the world go by. I didn't go out looking for a fling. I went out because I wanted to feel the spark again, that moment when your eyes meet someone else's across the room and you both know something unspoken just happened. It's been a while since I felt that. Life in my own city had become mechanical, work, errands, the occasional dinner with friends, but no real fire. There's something about winter that makes loneliness sharper. The cold presses against you from the outside, and the silence seeps in from within. Some nights I'd walk home from a cafe, my boots crunching on the icy pavement, the snow falling in lazy spirals under the streetlights, and I'd imagine someone walking beside me. Someone whose hand I could slip into my pocket along with mine to keep warm. I knew it was wishful thinking. This was my grandfather's town, not a bustling city full of opportunities. But hope is a stubborn thing. Even when logic tells you there's no reason, your heart keeps glancing over its shoulder, just in case. It was during one of those quiet, cold evenings, sitting alone at the bar of a place called the Lantern, that I realized how badly I wanted more than just a holiday escape. The whiskey in my glass was amber under the low golden lights, the chatter of a few regulars murmuring behind me. I looked at my reflection in the mirror behind the bar, and thought about how strange it was that I could be surrounded by people, and still feel entirely alone. I told myself that maybe it was enough just to be here, to rest and breathe and let the days unfold without forcing anything. But deep down, I wanted to meet someone who would make this winter unforgettable. Someone who could make this cold feel like warmth. It was a Thursday night when I saw her. The Lantern was quieter than usual, the kind of night when the jukebox played old songs no one requested, and the bartender leaned on the counter reading something on his phone. I sat at my usual spot, third stool from the end, where I could see both the door and the mirror behind the bar. She walked in like the winter wind had brought her, cold and sharp yet somehow warm in the way it brushes your skin before it numbs you. The first thing I noticed was her coat, dark green wool that fell just above her knees, cinched at the waist with a belt. Snowflakes clung to her shoulders and the tips of her hair, which was dark brown, almost black, and fell in soft waves. She looked like she had stepped out of a black and white photograph, the kind you find in a box of old memories. Her eyes, God, Her eyes were the kind that could hold a room without even trying. Deep, steady, framed by lashes that seemed too perfect to be real. She didn't scan the room nervously like some do when they enter alone. She simply moved forward with quiet purpose, as if she knew exactly why she was here and how long she would stay. She slid onto a stool 2 seats away from me and ordered something low and smooth, bourbon, neat. Her voice was calm but carried a kind of weight, the kind you feel more than hear. She rested one elbow on the bar and cradled her glass with both hands, her fingers long and delicate. When she lifted it to her lips, she closed her eyes for the briefest second, as if savoring the burn. I told myself to keep looking at my own drink, but there's a gravitational pull some people have. I don't mean attraction in the usual sense. I mean the way they pull your thoughts toward them without asking. I caught myself staring, and when she turned her head slightly, our eyes met in the mirror. She didn't smile, not fully, just a soft curve at the corner of her mouth, a quiet acknowledgement that she'd noticed me noticing her. I don't know what gave me the nerve, but I leaned slightly toward her and said, "Cold night for bourbon." She glanced at me directly then, her gaze steady. "Some nights need it," she said simply, her tone not unfriendly but not inviting conversation either. "What's this night for you?" I asked, keeping my voice light. Her lips twitched again, almost a smirk. "A short one," she said, sliding a bill onto the counter before I could think of a response. And just like that, she stood, pulling her coat tighter, and headed for the door. No glance back, no hesitation. I don't know what came over me. Maybe it was the way she carried herself, like there was more to her than she'd let anyone see in a single night. Maybe it was the quiet mystery in her voice, or the fact that she'd walked into my evening and unsettled something I hadn't realized was sleeping. Whatever it was, I found myself tossing a few bills on the bar, muttering a quick thanks to the bartender, and heading outside. The cold hit me instantly, but I spotted her almost right away. She walked quickly, her boots making soft thuds on the thin layer of snow. I kept my distance, telling myself I just wanted to see where she was headed, but my heartbeat suggested otherwise. The streets were nearly empty, lit only by the dim glow of street lamps. She turned a corner, and I followed. It didn't take long to realize she was heading toward the residential part of town, the same direction as my grandfather's house. My breath fogged in front of me, and I slowed, careful not to get too close. A few minutes later, she stopped in front of a modest 2-story house with a narrow porch. The windows were lit from inside, casting a warm, golden glow onto the snow below. She fished a key from her pocket, unlocked the door, and disappeared inside without a backward glance. I stood there for a moment, feeling like I'd just read the first line of a book I knew I'd have to finish. I didn't know her name, her story, or why the thought of walking away felt impossible. But I knew one thing: she lived here, in the same small town I was calling home for the holidays. On the walk back to my grandfather's, I kept replaying the brief conversation in my head, the look in her eyes, the almost smile. I told myself I was being ridiculous, that she probably wouldn't even remember me in the morning. Still, the thought of her lingered, soft and persistent, like the faint smell of her perfume that I swore the cold air had carried back to me, and somewhere between the crunch of my boots on snow and the quiet hum of the street lights above, I decided I'd have to see her again. The next morning, I told myself I'd let it go. People pass through our lives all the time, brushing against us for a moment and then fading away. But when I woke up, her face was the first thing in my mind. The way she'd looked in that dim bar light, the calm in her voice, it was like a thread had been tied to me, pulling me toward her without my consent. So when I left my grandfather's house later that day, I found myself taking the long way into town. I passed her street slowly, not expecting anything, but there she was, stepping out onto the porch in a grey sweater, locking the door behind her. She carried a tote bag and moved at an easy pace toward Main Street. I kept my distance, not close enough to draw attention, but near enough that I could watch her. She ducked into the little grocery store near the post office. Through the window, I saw her studying the produce section, tilting her head in that thoughtful way people do when they are weighing something in their mind. She picked up a bundle of fresh herbs, smelling them before setting them in her basket. It was such an ordinary thing, but watching her felt anything but ordinary. When she reached the counter, the cashier said something that made her laugh, really laugh, her head tilting back slightly, her eyes closing for a second. It was the first time I'd seen her smile fully, and I felt something inside me loosen. I didn't even know her name, yet here I was memorizing her laugh. Over the next couple of days, I saw her again and again. Once, she was walking down the street with a paper cup of coffee in one hand, her phone in the other, talking to someone who clearly made her happy. She had that faint, private smile people wear when they are speaking to someone they trust. Another time, I spotted her near the bookstore, pausing to look at the window display before disappearing inside. Each time, I told myself it was coincidence. Each time, I knew it wasn't. I was following her, not in an intrusive way, I convinced myself, but because I couldn't stand the thought of leaving it all to chance again. Something in me needed to know more, to see her in more than fleeting glimpses. But with every sighting, the guilt grew too. Who was I to hover at the edges of her life like this? If someone did the same to me, I'd call it strange at best, unsettling at worst. And yet, I couldn't bring myself to stop. She wasn't just another face in a small town. There was something in the way she moved through the world, like she was both present and somewhere else entirely, that pulled me in. On the third evening, I saw her outside a little cafe, sitting alone at a small table. Her coat was draped over the chair beside her, her hands wrapped around a steaming mug. She stared out the window at the street, not in a distracted way, but as if she was watching the world without really being part of it. I stood there across the street for a moment, the snow falling in thin, slow flakes around me, and I realized how absurd it had become. I didn't want to just watch her anymore. I wanted to hear her voice again, to learn the rhythm of it. I wanted to know the shape of her days, the things that made her laugh, the moments that made her quiet. It wasn't just attraction, it was a pull I couldn't explain. And maybe I didn't need to. By the time I turned toward home, I'd already made up my mind. The next time I saw her, I wouldn't just watch from the shadows of the street or from behind a shop window. I'd walk up to her, speak to her, and finally step into whatever it was I'd been circling for the past 3 days. It was just after 9 when I found myself standing on her street again. The snow had fallen heavier that day, softening the edges of everything, the roofs, the fences, the bare tree branches that reached like black lace against the pale night sky. My breath rose in steady clouds, and my boots crunched softly against the packed snow. Her house stood halfway down the block, the same warm amber light spilling from the windows. I could see the faint outline of a Christmas wreath on the door, its red ribbon dulled in the dim glow of the porch light. I told myself I was just passing by, but my feet slowed until I was standing still on the sidewalk. For a moment, I considered turning back. What was I even doing here? Knocking on the door of a woman who didn't know me, not really, after only a few brief encounters. But then the door opened. She stepped out, pulling on a pair of gloves, her hair loose around her shoulders. She froze when she saw me, her brows lifting slightly, not in fear, but in mild surprise, as though she had been expecting someone, and maybe, in some strange way, it was me. "Olivia," she said, and my name sounded startlingly right on her lips. It took me a second to respond. "Hi. I didn't know you knew my name." She gave the smallest smile. Small towns. Word gets around. She stepped off the porch and paused, studying me with an expression I couldn't read. "You look cold." "I've been walking," I said, which was true, though not the whole truth. "Come in for a bit. Warm up." The invitation was so casual, so unforced, that I didn't hesitate. I followed her up the porch steps and through the door into a world that felt entirely hers. The house was warm in a way that went beyond temperature. The living room was painted a soft, muted blue, with shelves lined in mismatched books, photographs, and small trinkets. A blanket lay draped over the arm of the couch, and the faint scent of vanilla and cedar hung in the air. She shrugged off her gloves and gestured toward the kitchen. "Coffee?" "Yes, please," I said, my voice softer than I intended. I watched her move about the kitchen, the easy way she poured water into the kettle and pulled 2 mugs from the cabinet. Her movements were deliberate, like someone who had learned to enjoy quiet moments. "So," she said after a pause, "you've been around." I felt heat rise to my cheeks. "I guess I have. I hope that's not creepy," she finished, glancing over her shoulder at me. "Maybe a little. But I'm not offended." Something in her tone made it clear she wasn't teasing me entirely, but there was no sharpness in it either. "I just wanted to see you again," I admitted. She turned back to the counter, but I thought I saw the corner of her mouth lift before she reached for the coffee. "I'm Emily," she said, sliding a mug toward me a moment later. "Emily," I repeated, letting the name settle in my mind. It suited her. We sat at the small kitchen table, steam curling from our cups. The first few minutes were light: where we were from, what brought me here for the holidays, her work at the local library. But slowly, the conversation began to slip into softer, more personal waters. She told me about her love for old books, the way she liked to walk late at night when the streets were quiet. I told her how city life had worn me down, how I'd come here hoping to breathe again. At some point, our hands rested on the table, only inches apart. She reached out, her fingers brushing mine lightly, almost testing. I didn't pull away. Her eyes lingered on mine, and the air between us shifted, warmer, heavier, like something unspoken had taken root. "I don't usually do this," she said softly. "Neither do I," I replied, though my pulse was racing. She leaned forward, her hand covering mine fully now, her thumb tracing slow, almost absent circles on my skin. I could smell the faint sweetness of her perfume, mingled with the sharper scent of coffee. When she kissed me, it wasn't sudden. It was as if the moment had been building for days, each glance and each unspoken thought pulling us closer until there was nowhere else to go. Her lips were soft, hesitant at first, and I felt her exhale against me, like she'd been holding her breath. I kissed her back, slowly, feeling the tentative press deepen, the rhythm finding itself in the quiet of the room. Time blurred. The snow outside could have been falling for minutes or hours. All I knew was the steady warmth of her, the subtle way her hand tightened on mine, the delicate slide of her fingers to the side of my neck. When we finally pulled back, she didn't let go of my hand. She just looked at me, her expression unreadable but unguarded. "Stay a while," she murmured. And without needing to think about it, I nodded. Emily stood, her fingers still loosely holding mine, and led me out of the kitchen. The hallway was dim, lit only by a small lamp on a narrow table, casting a warm, amber glow across the walls. Her steps were unhurried, almost hesitant, as if she was giving me time to change my mind. But I didn't want to. Her room was nothing like I'd imagined, and somehow exactly what I'd hoped. It wasn't large, but it felt lived in. The bed was covered with a thick quilt in shades of cream and soft green, slightly rumpled, as though she'd spent time sitting there earlier. A stack of books rested on the nightstand, and a half-burned candle filled the air with the faint scent of sandalwood. A single framed photograph sat on the dresser, turned slightly toward the wall, as if it was something she didn't want anyone to see too clearly. She let go of my hand and closed the door behind us, not to shut the world out completely, but to create a softer, quieter space inside. For a moment, she just stood there, watching me take in the room. There was no tension, no rush, just a stillness between us that felt safe. "Sit," she said gently, gesturing to the bed. I sat near the edge, my hands resting on my knees. She joined me, sitting close enough that our shoulders brushed. Neither of us spoke for a moment. Then she reached for the blanket at the foot of the bed and draped it loosely over both of us. A quiet act of care that made my chest ache. We lay back side by side, not facing each other at first. She traced slow patterns on the quilt with her fingers, and I listened to the rhythm of her breathing. Eventually, she turned toward me, propping herself up on one elbow. "You're not what I expected," she said softly. "What did you expect?" I asked. She shrugged. "I don't know. People who notice me are usually," she trailed off, her eyes flickering toward the ceiling before coming back to mine. "They are usually looking for something I'm not willing to give." I wanted to ask what she thought I was looking for, but instead I just said, "I'm here because I want to be." Her gaze softened at that, and she lay back down, this time close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from her. We talked in low voices, the way people do when the night makes them braver than the day ever could. She told me about the years she'd spent here, about how the quiet was both a comfort and a cage. She confessed that she hadn't let anyone close in a long time, not since a relationship that had ended badly, leaving her wary of letting anyone see her too clearly. "I think I forgot what it feels like to be known," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. I told how I understood. I shared pieces of my own life, the failed relationships, the moments I'd convinced myself I was better off alone, the restless ache that had followed me here. Somewhere between our stories, my hand found hers under the blanket, our fingers intertwining naturally. Hours slipped by without us noticing. The snow outside thickened against the windows, muffling the world beyond. At one point, she reached out and touched my cheek with the back of her hand, her thumb brushing lightly against my jaw, as though she was memorizing the shape of me. There was no urgency in any of it. Our closeness was less about need and more about recognition, two people who had been carrying the same quiet loneliness, finding it dissolve in each other's presence. We lay tangled under the blanket, our bodies not in the fever of desire, but in the steady warmth of being held without expectation. At one point, she rested her head against my shoulder, her hair spilling across me like dark silk. "I don't know why this feels so easy," she murmured. "Maybe because we've both been waiting for it," I said. She smiled faintly, her eyes half closed, as if letting herself believe it for just a moment. The night carried on around us in silence, broken only by the occasional hum of the heater and the sound of our breaths sinking. I felt something rare in that room, something I'd been missing for far too long. It wasn't just attraction, it was belonging. Like finding a place you didn't know you'd been searching for. Eventually, we drifted toward sleep, still wrapped in each other's warmth. My last thought before the edges of consciousness faded was that I could stay in this moment forever, and it would be enough. The next few days unfolded like something stolen from a life I didn't know I was allowed to have. Emily and I didn't speak of what had happened that first night in her room, not in any direct way, but it lived in every glance, every touch, every quiet moment that lingered longer than necessary. We saw each other when we could, moving carefully, almost like we were guarding a secret from the rest of the world. Some mornings, I'd find her waiting outside the cafe with two coffees, one already warming her hands and the other ready for me. She'd smile as she passed it over, a smile that was just for me, too intimate to share with anyone else. One afternoon, we walked together in the park. The snow lay thick over the grass, untouched except for the narrow paths cleared by other wanderers. Our breath clouded in the cold, and Emily's cheeks were flushed pink from the air. She didn't rush, and neither did I. At one point, she stopped to watch a pair of children sliding down a small hill, their laughter carrying through the stillness. I saw something soften in her expression then, a fleeting wish, maybe, or a memory she didn't speak aloud. Would sit on a bench, hands hidden together in her coat pocket, talking about nothing and everything. She told me about her favorite books, about how she loved winter because it made the world slow down, because it gave people an excuse to be closer. I told her about the cities I'd lived in, the jobs I'd left, the restlessness that had followed me here. Nights were our favorite. Sometimes she'd call me late, her voice low and tired from the day. We'd talk until one of us fell asleep mid-sentence, the phone still pressed to an ear, the comfort of knowing the other was listening enough to carry us into dreams. Other nights, I'd find her at my door with no real reason except that she'd been thinking of me. Every moment felt wrapped in winter's hush, like the world had agreed to keep our secret. The city's noise seemed far away, the snow muffled the usual rush, replacing it with a quiet that felt made for us. I started imagining a future, without meaning to, without realizing how dangerous hope can be. I pictured mornings where we didn't have to part, afternoons spent reading together on her couch, evenings cooking meals neither of us would be particularly good at, but would enjoy anyway. I thought about how she might look in the first days of spring, sunlight on her hair instead of snowlight, her laugh easier because winter had ended but what we had hadn't. She was careful with me, but not distant. She'd brush the back of her hand against mine while we stood in line for coffee. She'd tuck a stray hair behind my ear in the middle of a conversation. She never made big gestures, nothing for the world to notice, but her quiet care spoke louder than anything else could have. One night, we lay side by side again, this time on her couch. A movie played on the television, though neither of us was really watching. She rested her head on my chest, her arm draped over my waist. My hand moved idly through her hair, and I felt her relax more deeply than I'd ever seen. She told me, in a voice so soft I almost missed it, that she couldn't remember the last time she'd felt this kind of peace. I didn't tell her, but I couldn't either. The days passed like that, small rituals, unspoken promises, quiet joy. It was the kind of happiness that doesn't announce itself, the kind that slips in through the cracks and settles in your bones before you realize it's there. I carried it with me everywhere, warming me even in the coldest wind. But somewhere beneath the surface, I think I knew, nothing this perfect stays untouched forever. At first, I told myself it was nothing. A missed call here, a slightly delayed text there, those things happen. Life gets in the way. But with Emily, I'd learned to notice the smallest changes. She wasn't pulling away completely, but there were moments now where her eyes seemed far away, her voice softer, but not in the same tender way I'd grown used to. I started catching her on the phone more often. She'd be standing by the window, speaking in a low tone, her back half turned toward me. When she noticed me watching, she'd smile quickly, too quickly, and say, "It's just something I have to take care of." Then the subject would change. Some days, she'd seem entirely herself, teasing me about how I bundled up too much for the cold, brushing snow from my hair, as if she were allowed to do that forever. But other days, there was a weight in her gaze, as if she were holding a thought she didn't dare speak aloud. One Thursday night, she was supposed to meet me for dinner. I waited in the little Italian place we liked, a corner table tucked far enough away that we could talk without worrying about who might overhear. The minutes passed. 10. 20. I checked my phone. No message. No call. When I finally texted, "Everything okay?" she replied almost an hour later, "Sorry. Can't make it tonight. I'll explain later." But she didn't explain, not the next day, not the one after. I told myself not to press. Emily wasn't someone you could push into speaking, she gave herself on her own terms. But the not knowing settled into my chest like cold air that wouldn't leave, making it harder to breathe. I tried to be patient. We still met some nights, still talked until we forgot the time, but the silences between us felt different now. They weren't the comfortable pauses we used to share, these silences were filled with unspoken questions, with my own mind running in circles. I caught myself rehearsing how I might ask her what was going on. I'd imagine her telling me something simple, something harmless, something that would make all of this make sense. But in the darker corners of my mind, I imagined other answers, answers that would hurt to hear. One evening, I walked to her place without telling her. Snow was falling lightly, the kind of quiet winter night that used to feel like hours. But when I reached her street, I saw her silhouette in the window, head bowed, phone pressed to her ear. Her posture looked tired, and when she laughed at something, it didn't sound like the laugh she gave me. I turned back before she could see me. That night, lying in my bed, I told myself it wasn't fair to spy on her like that. We weren't anything official, maybe I didn't have the right to demand answers. But it didn't stop the ache, or the growing suspicion that whatever she was keeping from me was big enough to cast a shadow over everything we'd built. I wanted to believe it would pass, that whatever was pulling at her would let go, and she'd return to me fully. But even as I told myself this, I could feel something shifting beneath us, hairline fractures forming in what had felt so solid. Like glass, I thought. Beautiful. Fragile. And easy to break if you pressed too hard. So I decided, for now, not to press at all. I wasn't even supposed to be in that part of town. I'd finished work early and decided to wander through the old streets, the ones lined with antique shops and winterlit cafes. My mind was half on Emily, how I might ask her about the silences between us, when I saw her. At first, I didn't believe it was her. She was wearing the wool coat I loved, her hair pulled back loosely, snowflakes catching in the strands. But it wasn't just her. Another woman walked beside her, tall, elegant, with an easy grace. They weren't just walking together, their hands were intertwined, fingers laced like something long practiced. The sight hit me in the chest so hard I had to stop walking. My first thought wasn't anger, it was confusion, a scrambling in my head to find any explanation that didn't mean what it so clearly looked like. Maybe it was a sister, maybe a friend. But then I saw the way Emily looked at her, the soft smile that I'd thought was mine alone. They disappeared into a small bookstore. I didn't follow them. I couldn't. I stood in the cold, my breath unsteady, feeling like the ground had shifted beneath my feet. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur. I went home, sat on the couch, and stared at my phone. Every few minutes, I'd think, don't do this to yourself. Wait until she tells you. But the image of their joined hands wouldn't leave me. By nightfall, I'd made up my mind. When I knocked on her door, she looked surprised, but not like the night she first found me outside her home. This time, there was a flicker of something else in her eyes. Guilt, maybe. Olivia, she said softly. I wasn't expecting you. Clearly, I replied, my voice tighter than I'd intended. Can we talk? She stepped aside to let me in, and I walked past her into the living room. The warmth of the space felt different now, almost mocking in its coziness. I didn't waste time. I saw you today. In town. She froze, her hand still on the door. You saw me. With her. The word felt sharp in my mouth. Emily closed her eyes, exhaling slowly. Olivia. Don't, I said, my voice shaking. Don't tell me it's nothing. I saw you holding her hand. She crossed the room, but stopped just short of touching me. Her voice was low, almost breaking. She's my fiancé. For a moment, I couldn't process the words. They didn't fit with the woman I knew, with the hours we'd spent together talking about our lives, our futures. Your fiancé? Yes. She looked at me then, and there was no denial in her eyes, just exhaustion. We've been together for years. But it's not good between us anymore. Hasn't been for a long time. I stepped back, the room tilting slightly. And you didn't think I deserved to know. Her voice trembled now. I didn't plan this, Olivia. I didn't plan you. You came into my life and I felt something I haven't felt in years. You made me feel alive again. I didn't want to ruin that by telling you everything too soon. I shook my head, fighting the sting in my eyes. Too soon. We've been together for weeks. I've been imagining a future with you, and all this time. She doesn't know about us, Emily said quickly, as if that was some kind of comfort. I'm not proud of it. But I can't just leave her. There's so much tied between us. Family expectations. Financial commitments. If I walked away, it wouldn't just be my life that fell apart, it would be hers too. And part of me still feels responsible for her. I stared at her, my hands curling into fists at my sides. So what am I to you? An escape. A distraction until you figure out how to stay in a life you don't even want. Her face crumpled. No. You're the only thing that's felt real in so long. I'm trapped, Olivia. I don't know how to get out without destroying everything. The words hurt, because part of me wanted to believe them, wanted to believe that what we had was still real, still worth holding on to. But another part of me, the part that still had some self-respect, knew that no matter how beautiful our nights had been, they were built on a truth she'd kept from me. I turned toward the door. I can't do this, Emily. Not like this. If you want me in your life, then I need you to choose me. Not halfway. Not in secret. She didn't try to stop me. She just stood there, tears catching in her lashes, her hands hanging uselessly at her sides. Outside, the air was biting cold, but it felt cleaner than the air inside her house. I walked quickly, not looking back, because I knew if I did, I might not be able to keep walking at all. That night, the winter wind howled against the old wooden frame of Emily's house, but inside, the air was heavy and still. I stood in her doorway, unsure if my feet would carry me forward. She had called earlier, her voice trembling, asking me to come over. I already knew what this was. Goodbyes rarely needed to be spoken aloud. Emily opened the door quietly, like the sound itself might shatter the fragile moment between us. She didn't smile. Neither did I. Without a word, she took my hand, her fingers cold and thin, and led me inside. The house felt warmer than I remembered, yet emptier somehow, as if it already knew I wouldn't be coming back. We sat in her room, the dim lamp casting a soft golden hue over everything. For a while, we didn't speak. The silence wasn't awkward, it was thick with everything we couldn't say. She brushed a strand of hair behind my ear and gave me that look, the one that had undone me the first time I saw it. My chest tightened. I wanted to tell her I loved her. I wanted to ask her to choose me. But love, I'd learned, wasn't always enough to make people stay. She kissed me then, slow and lingering, as though trying to mimize the shape of my lips. Every movement felt deliberate, a quiet act of preservation, like she was storing me somewhere deep inside her, where no one else could touch. I held her close, breathing her in, afraid that if I let go, the memory would dissolve before morning. We lay together for hours, talking in whispers. She told me about her childhood, about how the sound of snow falling had always made her feel safe. I told her about the first time I realized I liked girls, and how lonely that realization had felt at 15. We didn't speak of her fiancé, or the life waiting for her beyond these walls. Those truths had already taken enough from us. When the clock edged past midnight, I felt it, the shift in the air, the quiet ache that meant it was time. Emily held my hand tighter, her eyes shimmering in the dim light. "I'm sorry," she whispered, and I could tell she meant it. I could also tell it didn't change anything. I kissed her one last time, letting the taste of her linger like the final note of a song. Then I stood, my legs heavy, my chest hollow. She walked me to the door, her hand slipping from mine like sand through my fingers. Outside, the night was bitter cold. Snowflakes drifted lazily from the sky, catching in my hair. I didn't look back. I couldn't. Somewhere behind me, in that warm little room, she was probably sitting on the edge of her bed, staring at the door the way I was staring at the road ahead, both of us knowing that something rare had been found and lost in the same breath. And just like that, the last night we'd ever have was over. The first light of morning crept through the thin curtains, spilling pale gold across Emily's room. I lay there for a moment, watching her sleep, her breath slow and even, her face softened in dreams. She looked peaceful, untouched by the heaviness that had kept me awake all night. I traced the outline of her hand resting on the blanket, memorizing the slope of her fingers, the gentle curve of her wrist. I wanted to kiss her awake, to hold her one more time. But I knew if I did, I wouldn't be able to leave. And I had to leave. So I slipped out of bed quietly, careful not to disturb her. The floorboards groaned under my weight, as if protesting my decision. My clothes were folded neatly on the chair. I dressed in silence, each movement deliberate, slow. When I picked up my coat, I paused and looked back at her one last time. There she was, the woman who had lit up my winter, who had pulled me into something I didn't know I needed, and who now, for reasons neither of us could fix, was going to become nothing more than a memory. Love could be like that, I realized, both beautiful and destructive. It could give you warmth in the coldest nights, and then leave you shivering long after it was gone. I stepped into the hallway, my footsteps muffled by the rug. The house smelled faintly of coffee and vanilla, and for a fleeting second, I thought about making a pot for when she woke up. But that felt too much like pretending there was a tomorrow. The door was cold against my palm as I opened it. Outside, the morning was a soft, endless white. Snow had fallen overnight, covering the streets, the trees, even the parked cars in a gentle hush. My breath rose in small clouds as I made my way to my car. When I slid into the driver's seat, I didn't start the engine right away. I just sat there, staring at the house through the windshield. Somewhere inside, Emily was still asleep, unaware that when she woke, I'd be gone. Maybe she'd know why. Maybe she wouldn't. Finally, I turned the key, the engine breaking the quiet. The tires crunched over fresh snow as I began to drive, each turn taking me farther from the warmth we'd shared. My chest felt tight, my throat raw, but my hand stayed steady on the wheel. The streets were nearly empty, lined with frost-coated trees, the world still waking up. I rolled down the window just enough to feel the sting of the winter air on my face. She touched more than my body, I whispered into the silence. My voice trembled, but I didn't care. She touched my soul, and then she let it go. The words disappeared into the cold morning, carried away like everything else we'd been. I didn't look back. I just kept driving.